Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Acknowledging the Fault Line of Cultural Exchanges in the Search of Reciprocity Beyond Geography. My name is Emmanuel Ortega. I'm a visiting professor here at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I specialize in 18th century Novo Hispanic visual culture as well as 19th century. And I want to welcome everybody to this panel. We are very lucky because we have several guests from around the world. So this promises to be a very fruitful conversation about residencies. So we'll start with our hosts, Francisco Guevara. Francisco is a visual artist. He's a co-founder and co-director of Arquetopia Foundation. He specializes in Levinasian ethics applied to the design of transcultural artistic projects and the analysis of performativity in contemporary art practices. His experience spans nearly 20 years of designing, curating, and managing art projects through visual arts education and historiography of art, facilitating development, sustainability, and social transformation. Guevara received his title of Expert in Management and Planning of Development, 8 projects in the fields of education, science, and culture from UNED, OAE, and CDL, a postgraduate degree in cultural management and communication from Flaxo, and studied race, gender, and the historiographies of art in the University of New Mexico. Welcome, and thank you, Francisco. And then with no specific order, we have Susanna GYULAMIRIYAN is a curator and art critic who has initiated and implemented numerous exhibitions, research and educational programs in Armenia and internationally. She was appointed curator of the Pavilion of the Republic of Armenia at the 58th International Art Exhibition, La Biennale di Venezia, in 2019. Susanna also co-founded non-governmental organizations, Art and Cultural Studies Laboratory, where she's currently the appointed president. In 2008, she initiated the Art Commune International Artists in Residence program in Armenia, where she either has managed and curated dozens of exhibitions and art events. Since 2006, she has been a member of Armenia International Associations of Art Critics, and her recent publications dedicated to Soviet Armenian women's art and feminist strategies in contemporary art practices of Armenia. Susanna worked also as a contributing editor for Cinema Arts, the Journal of Cinematography, and also contributor editor for a recently published book titled Dialogues with Power and Armenian Revolution at Venice Biennial. Very welcome, Susanna. And last but not least, we have John Louis. He grew up in Hong Kong and Beijing and Vancouver. He received his education in the United States with a Bachelor's of Fine Arts from Pratt Institute and a Master of Fine Art from Cranbrook Academy of Art. He has worked in commercial art galleries and artist residencies in the U.S. and China. Most recently, he was a residency director for Redgate Residency in Beijing. During his tenure at Redgate, he oversaw over 75 international artists a year who lived and worked in their studios. In 2017, he returned to Hong Kong and started the residency In-Situ. Welcome, everybody. So the theme, again, as I mentioned before, the theme of today's panel is acknowledging the fault of cultural exchanges in the search of reciprocity beyond geography. And I just want to read the description of the panel. And I have a quick presentation. And after that, we're going to have presentations from each one of you. We normally have about 10 minutes or so, but given that it's a small group, I feel like we can go beyond that, but I will give you a little bit of heads up when you have 2 minutes or so we can move into the next presenter. So as I mentioned, the description of the panel, so although the dynamism of the 21st century could suggest a positive impact for international exchanges due to mobility, geography, and its ideology implications, remains an ordering pattern that regulate encounters, connections, communications, and even organized international cooperation. As a result, international cultural mechanisms, conferences, educational institutions, and even residency networks function as authorities overseeing exchanges between geographical regions. Thus, cultural exchanges can become quite often a fantasy performance of mutual exchange and reciprocity, in cooperations between co-optation and appropriation, especially at artist residencies, where historical disparities play such an important role in locality and mobility. No discussion about mobility or cultural exchanges is complete without taking into account the implications of ideology and history. To present an alternative to the issue of cultural mobility in the context and legacy of the Grand Tour means a commitment to unraveling history from its investments with the grandiose narratives of citizenship, rights, nation state, and public private spheres. Allowing us to problematize our practice as artist residencies. So we have a couple of questions, which I will show here in the screen. So I'm about to start sharing my screen just to start this conversation. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so perfect. So before I begin the presentation, I wanted to start with these two questions. So we can think about these questions as we present our ideas, and we can come back to those questions towards the end of the presentations where we all finish. So the first one is, how can we facilitate movement in the cultural sector, making sure cultural mobility does not become cultural trafficking and movement at the expense of exploitation? And the second question is, how can we exercise reciprocity and solidarity among our artist residencies? So with the idea of the grand narratives of nationhood and the way that those fantasies may function within artist residencies, I have been recently working in trying to untangle the concept that is La Malinche. And La Malinche, Marina Malitzin, was a figure in the history of the so-called conquest of Tenochtitlan, or the invasion of the Aztec city that today is Mexico City, and the way that history has contextualized who she was according to those needs, according to each period. So as a constant ideology of self, identity in Mexico depends to these days on the sentimentalization of the binary of European and indigenous cultures meeting. In the colonial period, the formation of patria, fatherland, distinguished itself from the larger colonial period, the larger empire of Spain, through identification with Amerindian cultures. The Creole elite of the 17th century centered the formation of the race by way of romanticizing the encuentro, or the mythical encounter between Conquistador Hernán Cortés and the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma. In fact, the lifeblood of mestizaje has been kept alive for over 500 years by the visual culture of the conquista and the sentimentalization of the encounter. It is the integration of the personal and emotional into the realm of this history that allows for its flawed logic to continue to function today. The overall historiography of Novo Hispanic art and the history of figures such as Las Malinche are no different, and have always depended on the meeting of two empires, indigenous and European. And here we have a view of the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, which is one of the few documents that survives from the so-called Conquista. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the bottom of the image, you see the figure of La Malinche. And this is an important moment in history because we have Cortés trying to ally with the neighbors to the Aztecs, the Tlaxcaltecas, and the ideas that after this allyship, they're going to go ahead and conquer the Aztecs. The invasion of Tenochtitlan, or the so-called conquest of Mexico, has been mythologized throughout history, One of the first few colonial sources in which the Battle of Conquest appears is the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, and was created by native artists and commissioned by Luis de Velasco, Viceroy of New Spain, as a present to King Philip II between 1550 and 1556. The idealized meeting that we see here between Xicontecatl, Cortés, and La Malinche set the stage to the history of a visual culture that negotiates the importance of native peoples in the role of empire. This particular ambassadorial approach to native female agency disappeared during the colonial period and seldom materializes after the independence in 1821. Malinche's liminal political stance serves as an anchor to comprehend the ways in which the visual culture of Mexico has sentimentalized or has sentimentally negotiated the body of La Malinche. She is offered diplomatic agency here, allowing her an active role in the negotiations between the peninsulars and their potential new indigenous leaders. Her orator stance, one that intercedes between the epistemologies and languages of two countries, which was common in many early making contrasts once the sentimental images of the seductress begin to appear in the European popular imaginary during the first decades of the 19th century. And here we have an image that actually, it's an engraving that appeared from France, and it was inspired after a very successful opera from 1808 in France, and the name of the opera was Fernand Cortés. But here we see the figure of La Malinche that is completely changed from the last image that we saw. And just wanted to add that this is part of the sentimentalization of the conquest, the idea of the conquest. And instead of talking about that event as an invasion, we think about it as a conquest. And I wanted to add that this sentimentalization continues today. This is from a new TV series that it's appearing right now. It's called Hernán, la serie, again, creating a hero out of Hernán Cortés, which is specifically what different history books have done throughout history. And the relationship between Cortés and La Malinche is always romanticized. Here is a view again of the print from the middle of the 19th century, and on the left we see some of the original drawings of the dress of La Malinche from that opera. And again, she is very orientalized as opposed to any sort of attempt to create, and I hate this word, quote unquote, an authentic approach to the costumes of the Aztecs in the 16th century. So how and when did Marina's orator importance was transformed into the passive or over-sexualized conspirator we are familiar with today? Marina's discursive, and Marina is a name that the Spanish give to Malitzin or to La Malinche. Marina's discursive and visual transformation into the traitor or La Traidora is contingent to the formation of Mexico, or the concept of Mexico, in the historical and national imaginary as the mother of all mestizos. As noted by art historian Shirley Samuels, sentimentality acts upon the problem of the body, what it embodies, and how social, political, racial, and gender meanings are determined through their differential embodiments. El Indio, the Indian, the native body, and its subsequent encounter with Europe becomes the activating agent that centers the indigenous presence as the locus of a sentimental mestizo nation in Mexican visual culture. It is also the mandate of state institutions to exploit indulgent sentimental self-awareness for the purpose of national unity. As we begin to make sense of the portrayal of La Malinche through the lens of sentimentality, her role as a temptress begins to elucidate foundational patriarchal sentiments of the domestic that are to be projected in the realm of the national. In other words, the codification of her role as the mother of all mestizos embeds her image with a type of sentimentality that renders us as her children unable to accept her sexuality nor pardon her treason. Samuel continues, quote, "The sentimental complex also situates the reader or viewer, that is, the act of emotional response the work evokes, also produce the sentimental subject who consumes the work. End of quote. The nuanced articulation of her role as a historical seductress and traitor is best articulated in the sentimental words of Octavio Paz, who in 1966 declared de la Malinche, and this is a translation from the original quote in Spanish, quote, "She has become a figure that represents the Indians fascinated, raped, or seduced by the Spanish. And in the same way that a child does not forgive his mother for abandoning him to go in search of his father, the Mexican people do not forgive Malinche's betrayal." So with this idea of the sentimentalization of national narratives, I pose yet two more questions for the discussion today. The enticement of mobility is always contingent to romantic ideas of national history and identity. If we begin to make sense of history as a series of sentimental encounters, what is the role of artist residencies in the entanglement of those encounters? I don't know if the entanglement is a word, but it will be a word after today. Also, how do we destroy the sentimental aura of the nation from within our cultural centers of artistic dialogue and production? So I'll leave you with that, and I'll stop the presentation right now. And why don't we start with Susanna, and then again we can come back to those questions at the end of both presentations. Susanna, take it away.
Yes, I sent the very short text today to Nayeli and Fernandez. Just like short description how we approach to the post-colonial studies in concerning the post-Soviet situation in Armenia, because you know that mainly many scholars of post-colonial studies they said that it was for concerning the post-Soviet situation, that this side of the world, like post-Soviet side of the world, they keep mute and not very much speaking about it. But mainly like Western scholars, Western researchers, or or from India, you know, like Homi Bhabha, Arjuna Padure, and our scholars, they really involve the very interesting discourses, text about post-coloniality. I think that one of the member of our organization, Raj Bayajan, he's really the only one, I think, expert and intellectual who really approached to this issue to analyze, to criticize the uh, post-Soviet situation and the Soviet past using these tools of post-colonial studies. Because it's really very useful tools to start to think about your past under the Russian totalitarian system, because it was like, you know, we know that it was like proclaimed socialism in the Soviet time and equality of all Soviet republics in Soviet time, but the center was in Moscow, and the all imperatives to the other republics came from the Moscow, of course, and it was politics of total Russification of all national republics in the frame of the USSR. So I want to say that it was, maybe it was not so much like uh, colonization by Western countries, but anyway, uh, we think like Krach Bayajan is sure that these post-colonial studies tools could be really useful instrument to rethink about our past and about our and on our present time. Uh, I prepared a small speech uh, referring mainly to the issue of the geography. Uh, and it was really very interesting for me. It was like first of all, I want to say you thank you, because the text, everything was really very critical, analytical, not so much very uh, very descriptive, let's say, because it's really because it's Mexico, we have problem. When Europeans sometimes organize kind of webinars, they never articulate, never emphasize this kind of problem, like Eurocentrism, of course, and other issues which are uh, our questions, our troubling about it, because I am from Armenia, the Mexico, so we're out of it's so-called like the West. We are out of the West, so we sometimes really we know that there is hierarchies, strong hierarchies between countries, borders, and geographies. And that's why this idea of the grand tour, it's really interesting, because we know all of us really very informed that what it is, what it means, because like only male representatives of rich families, aristocrat families, or lately some bourgeois wealthy families, they could opportunity to have these educational tours around the world to get new knowledges for self, to be self-educated about the countries, and even bring the modernization, kind of modernization with their presence in the other countries, in the, let's say, that time there was not this kind of terms like third world or second world countries, etc. It's interesting, and it's interesting that women was absolutely out to be this kind of tourists in the world, and I am very thank you that you're emphasizing these gender problems, because I am very deeply involved in this kind of research, and maybe some of my book is dedicated to the feminist strategies of subversion in Armenian contemporary art practices. But I would love very much to go to the Soviet time too. There was no feminism. Feminism in Soviet Union was really dead in early 20s. And when Stalin came to the power, of course, he said that there is no sexual problem in the Soviet Union. There is no gender problem, because all of us now very equal, in very equal position. Women has opportunity to public work, to anything, but we know that it was kind of camouflage in Soviet time, because women really were in the very second positions in the Soviet time. So it was like the same situation. And sometimes Western feminists asked me why the Soviet feminist was not so much successful, like it happened in Western countries. I think the only problem is that uh, the politics, the gender politics, the uh, all issues, how it would be in Soviet time, they come from top to the bottom. So from power system to the people. And that's why it was not like grassrooted movements, feminist movements like in Western countries. That was much more later. In Soviet times, it started in 1920s. Uh, but anyway, that this grassrooted movement was more successful, of course, because it was not under the proclamation, strong laws about genders in Soviet time. So, but anyway, uh, then these things have solved these questions of their rights and freedoms now, but the struggle continues, we know. I would like to draw attention to the topic of geography. I mentioned that postcolonial studies, since they have a direct connection with the theme of geography, or rather imaginative geography, I can say. This is a title of very my lovely book of Edward Said, Orientalism, and this title of the book, Orientalism, it has the subtitle extension like Western concept of the East, about the East. So Orientalism is a Western concept. They think about what is East, what is West, and etc. So the topic of today's session, which you organized, um, it, it, uh, it really touches the issue of geography and uh, has been named by organizers as acknowledging the fault line of cultural exchanges in the search of reciprocity beyond geography. So there is the topic of geography is politicized, of course, in the title, but in a very in some utopian way in search of interaction bypassing geography, geopolitical context, and hierarchical order of the world structure. It should be noted that another many comforting and utopian ideas circulate in these pandemic days because it's really about like borderless, let's go beyond the border, let's go beyond the geography. I participated in several webinars, so this kind of, I think, the utopian idea really circulating. Um, uh, and many other ideas. Like recently, I was in the discussion, online discussion again, because we all live now in our working condition in virtual realm. So it was interesting that somebody said that imperialist order of a Western world or Soviet totalitarian system once collapsed, and it's quite possible that a post pandemic economic collapse will destroy the neoliberal capitalism and global democratization will be gained for all of us. So it's really interesting idea because I want to say that this kind of utopian idea that we believe that that could be really, we are very optimistic. I'm not optimistic, I want to say. I'm always analyze the situations of like to be beyond border or beyond geographies, or we can gain someday like global democratization because this neoliberal capitalist system will have collapse. So uh, I think that it's really very utopian idea. But in these days, maybe they are really helpful for many of us, even from the art field. So the idea proclaims equality of all sides of the world that faced with the deadly COVID virus. Like there is no more discriminatory separation between West and East. There is no discriminating global South and developed North. There is no vividly corrupt post-Soviet states, and all parts of the world are now equal. So this kind of, I participated in several webinars really where these kind of ideas circulated all time. But is that true or applicable for all countries in the world? And can we avoid the hierarchical borders or hierarchies in the imaginative geographies? Because geographies is imaginative, like say it persisting. It's not like something natural. It's like given. It's structures and that they could be really rethinking, revised from many angles. Uh, so, and about the working and living online in nowadays. So nowadays, remote work in the field of art is forced, of course, but uh, uh, threatens to become the norm. New normality is a freshly raised slogan nowadays. This might be financially beneficial to some or maybe to most international donor organizations, both public and private, as art activities via the internet are less expensive, like multitude of webinars, seminars, conferences when speakers and participants uh, uh, have their presence, they still stay regularly unpaid, of course. That's why it's economically painful, especially for third world or second world countries or fourth world countries and the artistic fields that are completely a part of any financial help. So these kind of ideas that online experiences is very good. They usually come from the European countries or Western countries, but for these kind of countries like Armenia, for Soviet countries, or even third world countries, I think the artistic field is really real catastrophe because we continue to work online, but without any payment. Yeah, I want to say that when European some initiatives invite me to have uh, some online speeches or evoke some discourses. I said, if you cannot pay, I don't want to participate because I know that they have enough financial support. Maybe not so much like in previous time before pandemic period, but I know so. For this webinar, this session, I was very ready because it's Mexico. Mexico. I want to say that it was really meaningful for me. Uh,
Susanna, just to let you know, you
mhm.
have a couple minutes.
Uh-huh. Uh, yes. So I have to cut somehow my text. Yes, a couple of words about nowadays virtual activities. High technologies causes not only concern that humanity hangs on the internet more often for non-professional purposes when real life passes by, but seems never before virtual realms perceived in a kind of menacing way. How easy all fields of work switch to the remote mode, and when the pandemic is over, the number of virtual trackers may not decrease, but on the contrary will even increase. How easy the internet replaced office workers, teachers, accountants, exhibits, and the word about art, which went completely online. And the closed real borders may not open as wide as before. In a local Armenian artistic environment, there is growing concern about working online. I want to say that in contrary to the many really Western countries, for them it's no problem. But he is really uh, very concerned about, like local artists really very concerned because it means that they even can lose their activities, entire activities. Um, and of course, many progressive thinkers emphasized that the pandemic may be opened up new possibilities to critique neoliberal capitalism, to redefine anti-militarist discourses and climate justice issues and questions forms and dimensions of resistance, but in line of imaginative geographies, the so-called third regions, uh, backwardness is still out now of any significant virtual discourses when the pandemic has really made a number of such socio-economic and political issues more visible for many of us. But the issue of borderless, like beyond of geography, beyond the physicality of the borders and geographies cannot solve real problems of less developed countries that have a risk to lose all their artistic activities and even art contexts. So now really like many artists really refuse idea to be in the art field. Uh, so, resignifying political reflections with our fellow colleagues and friends to issue of borders or geographies, old and new forms uh, of hierarchical geographies, especially, and imaginative politics is important as well as struggle against new normalization. Thank you. So this is like short speech just to provoke kind of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. This is very interesting because the the fantasies about nationhood now they're being in a way measured by availability to internet and different things like that, which we never thought about it before, or not in the same way that we do. So even our online interactions completely change the way that we understand each other, and the way that ideas of nations are growing, because it is about this online relationship, which the more I think about it, the stranger it seems, but it also makes so makes so much sense. Thank you so much, Susanna. So why don't we continue with John, and then Francisco, and then we'll come back and issue some of these ideas, not only just the questions that we post in the beginning, but also some of these ideas that are coming up, such as gender problems, the idea of borderless, the fantasy of the absence of borders now because we're all getting sick at the same rate at the same time, and different things like that. So John, why don't you start, and then we'll continue with Francisco. All right. We cannot hear you, Susanna. You want to say something?
Microphone was switched. No, I just want to say that even this idea which circulating now that we are all equal in equal position in the world. Uh, so it's really interesting issue to be discussed.
Yes,
So there are
definitely, definitely.
of course. Yeah, so John, sorry.
Yes, no problem. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Francisco and Nayali for including In-Situ and myself in this symposium. So I will speak on behalf of In-Situ, which is an artist residency based in Hong Kong. I will go through our website just to give a little context and introduction to our residency and what we do. And maybe throughout that, we'll address some of the issues, but I'm happy to talk more in the discussion part on the panel topics today. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. So I'm John Louis, and I'm the founder and director of In-Situ Artist Residency. I'm just going to give a brief introduction on our residency by walking through our website. So we're a year-round artist residency in the heart of Hong Kong that fosters international exchange through open call applications. These are some images of Hong Kong. And as we all know, it's a very dynamic, fast-paced city with a lot of skyscrapers, and it's a very kind of modern city. But at the same time, it's deeply rooted in its cultural heritage. Also, as an influential art hub, we have Art Basel and a lot of blue chip galleries that have moved to Hong Kong now, as well as the M Plus Museum. And so it's quite an interesting time and place to be in Hong Kong right now. Historically, obviously, it's been more of a tourist and finance focused city. But now the government and I guess the general Hong Kong population is becoming more open and more exposed to art and culture. And I think it's quite exciting to be here and to run a residency here at this time. So In-Situ is Latin for in place. Our mission is to support creatives so that they can explore Hong Kong and come up with new ideas after spending time here in place. We've been kind of discussing about virtual symposiums and the new avenues of interactions and collaborations that can happen virtually. But I think just one thing I'd like to highlight with residencies is just the idea of embodiment and being in a place fully present. That's something central to our residency and something that we want artists to fully embrace while they're here. Just a bit about our location. So Hong Kong is made up of the Hong Kong Island down here and Kowloon, which is a peninsula that shares a border with Shenzhen and mainland China. So we are based in right here in Kowloon. And a lot of the galleries and the kind of banks and financial district are in Hong Kong side, which is along the coast in Hong Kong Island. So we are here. The reason, we quite strategically picked our location is because we did want a studio space that was quite important to us. But a lot of the industrial areas are on the outskirts of the city. So there are some kind of galleries in industrial spaces here. And then artists in their studios, they have, studios in industrial areas right here and over here. What you find in these neighborhoods, though, is it is, in our opinion, still quite a sterile experience where it's just full of factories, and there's a lack of, how people really live in Hong Kong. And so in Toguawan, where we are, it is a residential neighborhood and area, but there are a few industrial buildings that we can have a studio in. Yeah. So that bottom were some images of Hong Kong. This is kind of our neighborhood. It's a very lively neighborhood. When artists come here, they can fully engage in how people live from day to day, from going to markets and checking out cafes, and see how people, do their errands, and just really be immersed in, local everyday Hong Kong lifestyle and culture. Our residency, I guess, yeah, I'll just highlight some central tenets of how we like to think about residencies. So we are less focused on final outcomes. Instead, we encourage research-based investigations, whether it be theoretical, material, formal. We also don't ask for detailed proposals or project schedules. In the application, we believe projects and ideas should be informed by spending time here. And also longer periods are encouraged. So this idea of final outcomes, Hong Kong is a place, as I've mentioned, with a thriving art market and a lot of amazing commercial galleries. But a lot of the commerce has to deal with the final product, the end product of art, and the commerce surrounding that. And so there is a lack of support for local artists and for this idea of process and production. For example, with the Art Basel fair in Hong Kong, a lot of collectors from the West would come here, and a lot of the art that's being sold is works that are made by mainland Chinese artists who are based in Beijing or Shanghai. And that transaction happens without a lot of attention to local Hong Kong artists, even though it's being hosted in Hong Kong. And so to kind of fill in the gap of the commercialization of art in Hong Kong, we really don't require artists to have a final exhibition, although we do have an open studio at the end of their residency here, where they can show anything from finished products to work in progress to any kind of research they've done. It's really up to the artist how much and how finished of the works they show. And I think to just drive home a little bit more on our application process, so yeah, we don't ask for specific detailed proposals. We really focus on the artist's work, and we look at their practice as a whole when we kind of start to evaluate applications. I think that brings a lot of the responsibility on the panelists who are looking at the work to decide if there'd be a good fit of what we can offer in terms of support for them and how our values aligns with the artists that end up being selected. But so we just, in a way, trust that if artists are able to work at high caliber, produce good work, if we can kind of sense that in their application, then when they come here, we trust that they'll use their time wisely, however it may be. And so they really don't need to propose anything. We just kind of empower them to feel liberated by having no constraints in a way, and to kind of leave any preconceived notions of what they might do before they get here. And I think that idea of leaving aside preconceived notions addresses some of the issues that we might be talking about later on in terms of cultural exploitation and appropriation. And so just to show a little bit on and talk about our space. So this is our residency space. Artists have, kind of a work area, but it's within a larger shared studio. Space and well, space in general is very precious commodity in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has one of the highest real estate prices in the world. And so oftentimes with artist residencies, which there aren't too very many in Hong Kong anyways, you almost have to pick between, are you going to offer the artist accommodation or studio space? We are an independent artist-run space. We don't have funding ourselves from the Hong Kong government. Artists may seek funding from their home government, but with our resources, we prioritized having studio space. And so we would help the artist find accommodations, whether through partners or whether through hostels or Airbnbs, and sometimes with like a third charity organization that have accommodations. But the activity surrounds the studio space. And we just think it's important that while you're here kind of exploring the city, looking at things, that it's important to have a place to kind of think through making and thinking through with your hands, and just to be able to explore and play and to fabricate, to just experiment. I think experimentation is something very important to us, and we hope that artists can maximize that to their fullest ability. These are some of the artists that have been here, and a quick highlight on some recent activities. I guess we'll just go through our Instagram account. So this is our last artist, Anna. She's from Portugal. We've definitely had to go through and navigate, not only, as many of you know, Hong Kong, we had the protest with the extradition bill, and most recently the new security law. And so Anna was here during the extradition bill protests. And so as things escalated, it would be dangerous if you didn't want to be part of the protest to go out. And so for many months as it was here, we had to navigate with Anna on how to even for her to come to the studio to work, or just to explore. And there were times where she just had to stay home for a few days when things kind of was quite serious. And then right on the heels of that, as maybe the last few weeks before she was about to leave, that's when the coronavirus was hitting Hong Kong quite hard. And we had to kind of scramble to figure if she was able to even get back to her home country. But so, certain activities we like to do is take them on field trips. And so Anna was very interested in archives and insects that might eat away at archives, these silverfish, and how that may be in a way an indirect erasure of history. And so we went to these secondhand bookstores and different antique shops in this particular neighborhood, and she found this document that it's called that had travel document for aliens, and she kind of used that in one of her pieces where she put these silverfish in this case, which do have a form that takes on kind of alien-esque shapes. And the idea was that it would slowly over time kind of eat away at the ink and the paper. These are times where we went to the bird market to look at bugs, or different stores that sold bugs. This is Brynjar. It's from Iceland. This is some of his works at his open studio, and his works displayed in a coffee shop that we actually were able to kind of partner with. This is Suma Silem from Austria.
Just to give you a heads up, you have a couple of minutes, John. Mm-hmm.
Yep, sure. I guess one or two things lastly to highlight. This is an exhibition that we hosted jointly with local artists. So the resident artist had an exhibition with local artists, and throughout that whole process, they were able to engage with each other, learn with each other, and eventually put on a show together. I think it's important for us to have and invite local artists interact with the international artists in residence as much as possible to share ideas, and in a way for them to learn from each other and to kind of dispel this idea that maybe Western artists would be able to come and with their education background know more or have more ideas. And so I think, you know, the more they can dialogue, the more they can learn from each other and kind of just have this mutual kind of understanding and engagement. And yeah, so lastly, this is an artist talk with another artist residency in Hong Kong. So Tong Lao Space is an artist residency, also an artist run one. And in a way for local artists and residencies to collaborate, we hosted an artist talk together where our residents and their residents shared with each other and kind of gave a background and presentation of their works in another way to engage with each other and collaborate together. So I think those are just some examples of partnerships and collaborations we've done in the past. And we do hope that we can collaborate more with artist residencies abroad for, you know, residency exchanges and for us to keep fostering more dialogue and more collaboration. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It's very interesting to think about the current political situations of each country. And I think this panel shows that there's very specific approaches to some of the perceived problems, political problems by residencies. So it will be interesting to talk about how the different national and international political policies of each country have affected the residencies, but we can come back to that. So why don't we continue with Francisco, and then we'll start our conversation.
Yes, thank you. I think, John, you have to stop your sharing your screen.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, we want to thank you all for being here with us. As you know, we are the host. I'm Francisco GUEVARA, co-executive director, and she's Nayeli Hernandez, our programs coordinator. And thank you, Emmanuel, for the very precise introduction to the panel, because thinking about the encounter is what residencies are all about, and also thinking about the visual culture of La Conquista, which has had a long-lasting legacy on everything that we experience. And I have a short presentation that I want to talk about and connect with some experiences. I think what you also mentioned in terms of sentimentalization, and specifically in Latin America, is well and alive today. It's something that we continue to experience. And I will also share a very brief experience that I had with one of the editors when I was thinking about writing a piece on mobility, and specifically on cultural mobility, and also how that triggered this symposium idea, because that resonated so much that it eventually became every single panel for the discussions that we have thought of and the questions that we have been thinking about. And specifically thinking about sentimentality and what you mentioned in terms of Shirley Samuels is precisely how it situates us. It puts us in our place, not necessarily in space and time, but actually puts us in our place historically, which of course it's absurd. And of course it refers to the idea of geography and Orientalism, as Susanna was sharing. And of course it has to do with Eurocentrism. So the presentation that I have today has to do with the idea of disrupting. And I will connect many of the ideas that we've seen through the symposium. And of course I want to begin with the knowledge of the generous knowledge that Kirsten Buick has shared with us through the years. So let me share my screen now. Okay, can you see it?
I see.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we can see.
Perfect. So this is one of the answers that Kirsten Buick gave at the end of her keynote speak. Shakespeare said, "All the world is a stage." Mitchell in Colonizing Egypt says, "All the world is an exhibition." I say, "All the world is a zoo." And we'll continue thinking about this idea. So as we've been thinking about the different panels, I always go back to the work of Audre Lorde. And this is one of the most important quotes that I added a few things to rethink what we are experiencing today. What does it mean when the tools of a racist, of course, classist, sexist, ageist, etc., patriarchy, which I define as hate, are used to examine the fruits of the same patriarchy, hate? And this is the example when when I was asked to write about a piece on mobility and cultural mobility in relation to the actual relationships between Europe and Latin America. And I had this very strange meeting with one of the editors who read the first draft of the piece, and he said, and these were sort of his words. He said, "It's a shame that you missed the opportunity to celebrate the relationships between Europe and Latin America." And then I asked him questions to precisely contextualize it, because what I told him is, it's actually a shame that you don't see the opportunity to rethink those relationships as opposed to celebrate history. And these are three key points that I talk about and I think about when we are actually discussing cultural mobility. Cultural mobility has deep historical implications with long-lasting damaging consequences in many regions of the world, like Latin America and the Caribbean, most often concealing a skewed perspective on these regions while romanticizing the transformative potential of art. And this is empathy, which is the social emotion. And I will also share a few slides that Kirsten Buick shared with us in regard to the process of art making and international encounters. And this is also why we provided a critical context to think about residencies. Mobility is capable of reproducing representational strategies with ideological effects, including the racialization of spaces and the specialization of class, which is also something that Susanna mentioned in her presentation, especially considering that there is no increase in movement without extensive systems of immobility. And just like Susanna, I'm also very cynical and not necessarily optimistic. And as Kirsten Buick also says, technology will not save us. So we have to think about that there is no increase in movement without extensive systems of immobility. Freedom, cooperation, as well as cultural mobility are terms that are used under the assumption that we all understand the same thing. And quite often they enact ideological silences, allowing historical rooted violence to prevail. So I also want to think about this phrase that Kirsten gave us. We are trapped in structures that are very, very old. And when I think about the experience of writing the essay on mobility, I always go back to these kinds of images. And this is Bronislaw Malinowski confronting the sorcerer circa 1914. And then you compare it again with America by Fyodor de Gaulle from Nova Reperta in the 1600s. And this is why we have to rethink that these are very, very old structures. This is how usually the encounters are framed. So other is a verb and should never be a noun. Other, as so popularly conceived and so effectively theorized, is not a noun but a verb. The quote other unquote does not rest in the embodied experience of Black, trans, gay, non-white, non-male people, but instead is a process, a pervasive form of toxic racial and heteronormative formation that is performative, relational, and participatory in the creation, recreation, and maintenance of white supremacy to detriment of Black, trans, gay, non-white, non-male people everywhere. And again, this is from Monumentality, an essay by Kirsten Buick from the from Augusta Savage, Renaissance Woman by Jeffrey Haynes. And I want to share the thoughts and empathy. And this is also a slide that Kirsten shared with us. With art comes empathy. It allows us to look through someone else's eyes. It expands the moral imagination. When we are without art, we are a diminished people, myopic, unlearned, and cruel. And empathy is actually the problem. The ethical obligation to the other is not met by empathy, because empathy implies a phenomenal understanding of the other and his or her world. The radical authority of the other means that the other comes from beyond any understanding at the phenomenal level. And this is Gilbert Garza and Brittany Landrum, Ethics and the Primacy of the Other. And again, I want to think about geography. Whenever we think about residencies, we always have to go back to the history of residencies and how Eurocentrism has focused most of the networks, most of the offices in Europe, and with a very specific perspective from Europe. And this is why geography has to be challenged. So, what is the solution to that? And again, this is Christian Buick. We are working in structures that are old. People can afford to travel to the human zoo. The human zoo doesn't have to come to you on the back of a world fair. All the world is a zoo. And of course, this connects with Edward Said's Orientalism, and also rethinking how residencies can actually participate in the idea of the human zoo. So the solution that I think about has to do with Jack Ranciere's idea of the census. What the census means is an organization of the sensible, where there is neither a reality concealed behind appearances nor a single regime of presentation and interpretation of the giving imposing its obvious on all. It means that every situation can be cracked open from the inside, reconfiguring a different regime of perception and signification. To reconfigure the landscape of what can be seen and what can be thought is to alter the field of the possible and the disruption of capacities and incapacities. The census brings back into play both the obviousness of what can be perceived, thought, and done, and the distribution of those who are capable of perceiving, thinking, and altering the coordinates of the shared world. And I finish with the map of the symposium, rethinking how geography is the challenge that we face. Just like Susanna was mentioning, I don't think coronavirus and the crisis is actually giving the possibility of a borderless world. It's actually the opposite. It's a world with more strict borders that have moved to the front door of our homes. So we have to rethink, how do we challenge these ideas of geography? How do we challenge and how do we think about a new possible topography? And I want to finish here so that we can open up for discussions, because there are many ideas that we can reconnect through the process of residencies and, of course, the questions that Emmanuel has posed.
Yes. So why don't we start with these ideas of geography? I think that's super interesting, and I think it pertains a lot to what all of us are talking about. We can come back to other questions, but this sense that you post at the end, borders have moved into our home, and how they have affected the way that residencies are and will be conducted. I wondered if you thought about that. I mean, obviously, Francisco, you post that, but I wondered if John and Susanna have thought about some of these ideas. And you can, yes,
Switching off.
I can hear you now, Susanna.
Uh, I honestly, like recently, I had a talk with some European colleagues, and they said that you can continue the residency program, uh, but with that kind of artists that interested in research. So you can give them materials, they can have their research, they can really go through these materials, these texts to understand like, but I said that, you know, that it's mainly not artists who are interested in the text or some kind of really like academical analysis with many references and etc. This is artistic residency. Of course, it doesn't mean that curators or critics or analysts never can come. No, it's open. Even recently, we started to host musician and dancers because many proposals from them, and I realized, but why not? If they really would love to come to Armenia to have their research, I'm not professional in this field of culture, but we could be helpful to give them some information, to organize some meeting with professionals in this field. So want to say that we really don't know. I can't imagine residency online, honestly, because main part of the attendances, residents, they are artists, so they're visual artists. Of course, we don't work with traditional art. It's contemporary art, quite critical, and etc. And it's not only about production. We never persist that artists must have production to show their uh, mm, their works publicly. No, it's up on the artist's decisions always. If they want to have exhibition, we are ready to be very helpful to find the space. We have no our own space for exhibition. So usually it's a kind kind of negotiations with different spaces in Yerevan. Uh, but want to say that anyway, that even without this final production moment, the artist residency must really be evolving alive. I can't imagine it like online. We don't know how long this situation really maybe will be prolonged again and again, like in Armenia now, quarantine, prolonging again and again. Every month they said another month we have to stay in self-isolation, etc. So that's why when Francisco said that residency, like the borders, reached our home. Yes, it's reached our home because of this isolation. It's really very hard to, because we are highly isolated. We have our very local borders and never go step, have a step beyond of this. But as for the residencies, I think that we need open borders anyway. Without it, I can't imagine the activities, especially in this field of activities like artist residency.
All right.
This is what
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you so much for that. John?
Yeah, I think I agree with Susanna that it might be hard for artist residencies to stay virtual. I think for us, we're questioning this a lot ourselves, even as an organization, that has a place and a space. What is required moving forth? Um, I guess during this whole process, we have lost our space. As I mentioned before, like, with the high cost of rent in Hong Kong, being that we don't know when we can receive artists again, we have let go of our studio space. So in the moment, we are in a limbo where we don't have a space. And I feel like a lot of our identity was tied up into having a physical space. And what I mentioned with working through your hands and making and um and so I think it is, everything leads to opportunities, and now it is a time that we can question. And I think up until before um the pandemic happened, it was great that we had different organizations that we were partnering with to kind of fulfill certain needs that we weren't able to fulfill ourselves, um, such as like the housing situation. But even I am kind of thinking, even if we, if the borders kind of open and we are able to receive artists again, do we necessarily need a studio space? Are we able to kind of work with other partners to just kind of bridge all these resources together, where we could still create a very enriching and fulfilling program, but not necessarily needing to rent a space ourselves. And so that's just something we're kind of working through. And I think, there won't be any answers right now, so we'll kind of have to wait and see. But I am glad in the meantime that we can have discussions about it, and to be able to have symposiums like this to kind of think through, and to also meet others. And so, yeah.
Francisco, you want to add? Oh, go ahead, Susanna.
Emmanuel, just a question, very practical question out of theories to John. I'm just wondering, if your residency, you have financial support from the state institutions or local foundations, how you work within the residency, how you launch it, and how it continues the life.
Yeah, currently we don't have any government funding or private funding. So the artists are either gaining funding from their home countries or self-funding themselves. One interesting thing, our first resident was a mainland Chinese artist who was studying in London at the time. And so originally we kind of had thought, okay, an arts residency, we wanted to foster international exchange. So we had our own preconceived notions that we should be receiving like foreigners coming to Hong Kong. But then now we have a resident who is of Chinese nationality, but she is studying abroad right now and wanting to come to Hong Kong. And so, through discussions with her, like we were happy to receive her, and she was able to, she had never come to Hong Kong before, and she actually had to confront a lot of ideas kind of that may have clashed between Hong Kong identity and Hong Kongers' views of mainland Chinese. And so it was quite a realization to her that there were different perspectives on that. And so, yeah, I think that was quite an interesting experience. And so, yeah.
Thank you.
Francisco, go ahead.
Well, I mean, with the more practical stuff, I mean, so in Hong Kong there is funding, right? I wouldn't say there isn't, but they generally are for more established art institutions. And so our goal was to, I think we don't necessarily want to sustain where artists have to self-fund or gain funding from abroad, but we have to kind of establish ourselves for a number of years before we can prove to the Hong Kong funders that all the activities that we're doing in order to gain funding. So it'll be a few years before we can gain funding, and then eventually the goal is to either send Hong Kong artists abroad or be able to fund people to come ourselves. Yeah.
Just for a small remark that our residency work in the same way. We have absolutely any funding, so artists try to find some financial support by themselves. Of course, with our supportive documents, like official invitation, like any kind of description why this artist is really important that they come for their researches and residency and learning. So we work in the same way, but just several times we have some suggestions for our countries, like we have exchanges between artists. Like the artists from Milan came and stay here, and they're working, and Armenian artists go, and we have usually final exhibition in these countries abroad. Yeah, so we work in the same scheme, I want to say.
Thank you. Francisco?
Yes. Well, these are very interesting questions because I think it goes back to many of the points that you introduced in the beginning. The idea of the home being necessary to be the space where we are placed has to do with nationalism, and it also has to do with gender. And as Susanna was mentioning in the beginning, it makes sense that because gender reorganized the nation, and it makes sense when the system has apparently collapsed. This is what we're perceiving, not necessarily that what it is, that we have to be reorganized and sent home. And in that sense, geography operates in a similar way as landscape. Although it has a different root in terms of the source of knowledge, it does function in a similar way. It's not about space as we've been thinking about in the beginning of the symposium all the way through different panels. Space lives, place is dead. And in that sense, geography creates a grid where everything is mapped and controlled. So to imagine that because of the pandemic, we are all experiencing the same, it's impossible. And this is why empathy is more than ever relevant, because in the process of encounters, we imagine that art, because art is very powerful, it is true, art cannot be separated from power. And the history of art is a history of power and the history of extermination. So we imagine that because art is powerful in the encounter, it would actually allow things to change. And I don't think it's as simple as having art in a place and then things change. It's actually more complex than that. And in many ways, it is what we have to think about when we have residencies. How do we think about place? How do we challenge history? How do we go back to a sense of space and history?
This is a really interesting point because the perceived idea was that this you could hear it everywhere, that there was a radical change about to happen in the world. We have to be home for that to happen. I remember I saw not too long ago a YouTube video about passive social justice, and they play that song by John Mayer, Waiting for the World to Change. Kind of like you have to go home, wait for the systems to change, and just hoping that the world will change. But you're absolutely right about empathy, that it is now heightened. And one of the ethics of sentimentality is consumption. So all of these systems affect us personally to push us to consume, to push us to keep buying things. And now we're all at the same ground where we can do that. And that, of course, brought yet another set of problems for the people that cannot afford to sit down and empathize and consume and wait for the world to change, which we saw it with people still working, people that the world did not change for them or was not going to change. So how do you all think that having artists waiting for the world to change at their homes, and then the borders quote unquote opening again, going to visit the residencies, how is that going to change? Do you think it's going to change the perception of the way that they're going to consume the residency? Do you think that's going to change? How are you as directors are trying to stop the continuation of those ideas that were fostered in the place that is home within the spaces that you all provide for artists?
Yes, I think the one of the very interesting things that we found throughout the symposium and the panels is that residencies are very complicated residency spaces. As we know, we are, as we all have all our residencies are very complicated. And the questions that Susanna was asking about the structure are very relevant. I don't think there will be any funding anymore. And this is a reality that we all have to face. This is why it is necessary to rethink how do we relate with each other, because what has been happening is that larger structures of art have moved their infrastructure, and move is a way of saying not necessarily that they move their resources, but the load that they had to produce the artwork, and that would be a biennale, a museum, has moved into the residency. Yet residencies are being confronted with the reality that there's no resources, specifically funding, to be able to provide the process of expanding these discourses. So what we see in residencies is that we are spaces in between private and public. We're not really a museum. We're not really a home. We're something in between, which is a very interesting position to rethink nationalism. And now that nationalism is in the rise, and now that we see that nationalism is more relevant than ever because of home, because of borders, then we have to rethink what is our role in terms of residencies. And the question that you're asking is very, very important because I don't think artists are waiting. Many of our artists are impatiently producing anything they can because as I have mentioned before, artists might not find a solution. Probably they will never will. And our historians will look at their work and explore different possibilities and try to imagine what were they trying to think or do. But what is in many ways not hopeful but action is that they are seeking for these answers. So they keep producing and they keep asking and they keep so once borders are reopened again in whatever way, residencies will be very different. I don't think residencies can be as they imagine. And this is also why we were thinking, is it really the end of the Grand Tour? Which would be incredible if it were. If museums have to give back the work that they stole, if biennales have to rethink how not to destroy Venice because of tourism, is it really the end of the Grand Tour? And if it's so, we have the possibility as residencies to rethink that because we are in between. We're something very unique and very strange.
Susanna?
Yes, just about nationalism, like out of this practical, but there are no funding. It's really very hard how it will be. I want to say that in situation with artistic field in Armenia is not so optimistic because they stopped to do anything. There is no money. Everybody now really concentrate how to find another work to earn some money to survive. So this situation mainly in Armenia, I want to say. But about like nationalism, it's interesting because like in Soviet time, there was grand narrative because we are all circling in the narrative, we are all surviving in several narratives, which is really very important. But in Soviet time, it was some kind of grand narrative of socialism, like equality between all citizens of the Soviet Union. But when you really making grand narratives, you must really give the hope to the people. Like why this socialism? Because it's equality, because everybody must have work, no rich people, like really kind of interesting paradise, something like this. But in nowadays situation, the Francisco mentioned nationalists. Really, the nationalists really have ambition to gain this place of grand narrative. But like in Armenia, it's the same. That this that nationalism really, especially after Soviet time, because the identity was not national Armenian, for instance, identity. It was Soviet Armenian identity. So with more emphasizing on the Soviet citizen, but not like national citizen. Like national politics was possible, like not to have so many protests, that not to banish absolutely the national identities, but want to say it was like ideology, socialist ideology, communism in the upcoming future, like it was proclaimed in the Soviet time. But want to say that nationalism now, in spite of the global ideologies about globalism, etc., but it's really weak uh, attempts and kind of practices because like in Armenia the local government really start to combine that all citizens to be faithful to the government, and the first idea is nationalism. Like they try to really gather all Armenians under this idea of Armenian genocide. That we really that more than 1 million people were killed, etc. So and we live in the conflict zone, that there is Karabakh and Azerbaijani Karabakh conflict, frozen conflict, of course, but Karabakh. So I want to say that this militarist ideology circulating all time. So what about residency? It's interesting that sometimes artists really to want to be very complimentary to the local scenes, and they directly want to go to this some kind of national um, yeah, national ideas, national concepts, and want to work on the theme of the genocide, want to work on the uh, this Karabakh war, and etc. etc. With with the symbols, with the kind of things which symbolizing like nation, like pomegranate, grapefruits, and etc. So I want to say like what is circulated in Armenia. I never welcome this kind of attempts of artists because they directly go to be in the closer connection with powerful ideology, but we really want to have this distance with power system, the state system. That this distance really allow us to be critical all time, not to be like in conform and comfort situation with the powerful system. So I want to say that sometimes artists, even contemporary artists, not, we never work with traditional artists, which are really more conservative, and etc. So it's interesting. I think that residency is like now, if when we can say that grand narrative is really maybe finished, and like Wittgenstein said that now we are more interesting and more important to have like small communities with different languages we have to play with each other, but not to be um, like unified under the one grand narrative. So, but how we can really deal with each other? What is the language to speak with each other? Even in the frame of the residency, when many international artists, many international professionals come. So once I said then that it's very important that these small groups were not like under the one grand narratives, were really like divided on different groups. It's very important. What could be really unified us? It's our uh, how we experience it with power. So with the centralized system, so we are margins. If we use this word of marginal in the positive sense, of course, because there is the it has even not no not positive connotations, this word of margin. But we're in the margins. So how what could be really the one common thing between us to understand each other, to stay at our critical position, to never give up this analytical thinking and keep distance with power, because only this kind of position could really allow you to be critical of analytic. Otherwise, you have to be very conformist with the power system. So I think that so I want to say that in the residency we have this kind of discussions many times, and I think that it's really interesting when artists come not to be very complimentary, to start directly to work with your ethnographics. So, but this is again the point of view from the Western countries, because sometimes Armenia, for instance, for them is kind of exotic fruit, which they try to conceptualize, let's say. So for me, it's really very important in the frame of residency to deal in this way with many international guests, artists, and other professionals.
This is very interesting because at the core of sentimentality, and this goes combining with what Paco is saying, it's empathy. So empathizing with those
Mhm.
national, whatever that means, tragedies, becomes the core of the production of so many artists. And
Yes. Yeah,
in
trauma. I
living.
understand trauma. I understand the notion of trauma. Even
Mhm,
feminists, women's works very often refer to the notion of trauma, like some
mhm,
traumatic experience, etc. But concentrate on it when it's part of powerful ideology. I think it's very
right,
dangerous,
right.
really.
Very
It
dangerous.
could be references to the trauma, but not when it is really part of powerful ideology. It's dangerous, really, very dangerous way to go to your artistic researches or something. So in the
Correct.
residency, I try really to be out just this post, like many European artists, they said that we first time heard about post-colonial studies when we attend Armenia because it's interesting. Otherwise, really, this Eurocentrism really like occupied their brains sometimes. So to understand our part of the world from this point of view is really, I think it's really very important. But not go to the souvenirs or some kind of exotic, which is orientalistic, that like go to the Orientalism, let's say, because for Western countries, sometimes the other part of the world, which is not West, it's kind of exotic. They really orient. Maybe they don't understand very much some artists, but they orientalized the other part of the world very
Always,
often.
I like that notion of the the su- the souvenir trauma shop because it is at the end, again, as I mentioned before, it's consumable. As long as it's consumable and heightens this sentiment of nation, they're going to be alive. And in in a way, the state necessitates artists to feed into those sentiments. Speaking coming back to the idea of borders, John, Hong Kong is in a very precise point in terms of nationalism. So, how you talk a little bit about it with the experience of the Portuguese artists, but in moving forward with everything, with what's happening with COVID and also what's happening with the protests, how do you envision that the residency is going to negotiate some of these ideas and fantasies about nationhood, both in the grand scheme of the narratives that come from the 19th century, but also the ones that have been forming as we speak?
Yeah, so I guess just some context into what is happening. Um, Hong Kong obviously is a post a British uh, former colony, and in '97 Hong Kong was returned back to China, and so they implemented the one country two system uh, kind of governance, where Hong Kong still followed the law that was set up by the British, and were able to autonomously govern and make policies, and in a way um, kind of make political ideas and enact policies uh, autonomously from mainland China. And so it's one country, but there's two systems. Um, and supposedly, for 50 years, um, that would not be touched until eventually maybe we would be kind of more integrated, and the certain gray areas would kind of be like, it would be a transition period to kind of one whole party rule. I guess some of the turmoil is the feeling of an imposition of the Communist Party onto Hong Kong governance. Certain uh, specific policies, like the extradition bill, which was the ability for um, criminals to be extradited to be tried in mainland China, which many people felt oftentimes uh, people were not given a fair trial in China, and so it was, you know, um, in an imposition of this kind of one country, two system agreement. And I think in terms of creativity, the most recent bill, which is the new security measures, we talked about how artists maybe are sitting at home kind of waiting until the borders open. I do agree with Francisco that a lot of artists are not necessarily sitting on their hands and are kind of thinking through and making things. Even throughout the protests in Hong Kong, we have experienced a lot of artists, expressing themselves creatively about their views and creating like a really amazing kind of protest art and different creative ways to express themselves. But the new security law now, if you create any slogans or any expression that is against the government or any kind of like any form of you want Hong Kong wanting to be independent of China, you can be exposed to being tried in China. So people are now in a way, like recently, many people have posted on social media or even in restaurants. Maybe if they're pro-democracy, they would post slogans in their restaurants. Everyone has taken it down now that the new security law has passed. So any form of kind of that expression has been taken down and in a way censored. And so I think moving forward, this is definitely a tricky area for any creatives who are based in Hong Kong and would want to come to Hong Kong. In a way, Hong Kong people feel this freedom of expression has been taken away from them, and so it's definitely a tricky thing moving forward. And I think there's just so many unknowns, and I think it's something we will have to kind of negotiate and navigate with artists. So I mean, I don't have any answers necessarily, and I think people are still kind of, even though they had set this regulation, we don't know exactly how that'll play out. So we in a way have to see how that'll be, like how much they actually enforce it and whatnot. So there's a lot of unsettled things that we have to kind of wait and see. So yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. Francisco, you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think the questions that we are thinking about are very relevant to the future in many ways. The idea that the technology could actually save us is something that we need to understand that it's impossible, because it has been created by the same system. So even the illusion of privacy, it's just a fantasy. Of course, we experience it differently depending on class, depending on gender, depending on the specific place where we are located. But we also see how the government had either transferred some responsibilities to corporations or lost them, and then corporations take over that. So it is something to think about. And I really also want to connect the ideas that Susanna was mentioning, because it's very relevant to the experience in Mexico. And Mexico lives on the legacy of genocide, not necessarily with that terminology, because we have transformed it through history, starting from the idea of the conquest all the way to the drug cartels. But the similar phenomenon has happened. And genocide is very sexy to the art world. It's absolutely sexy to the art world. And it also makes the fantasy of traveling even more sexier, because it makes you want to keep danger near. And when Susanna was explaining her experience, I was thinking about nationalism. I think about what else could we talk about, which is Teresa Margolles' project at La Biennale di Venezia. And it is actually a project that Cuauhtémoc Medina invented, and how he imagined himself as an activist when it was actually sponsored by the government in a national pavilion. And this is also why we have to go back to the idea of human zoos. how we went from the world as an exhibition, and we present genocide with a gift shop where you can actually breathe whatever was put in the pavilion as part of the process of extermination, and how it is very profitable. And I also want to, I think about how these ideas, and Rebecca from Anafasti Art Space mentioned it and define it in a very, very precise way. It's actually a scam. It's actually not the grandiose narrative, but it's actually the grand scam. And and of course, again, we have to think about how we're living and working in structures that are very old. And it is a human, it's a zoo. And in that sense, my perspective is to remind residents that the residency is actually the relationship they establish with each other in residency, but also with us. It's not history, it's not place, it's actually how we correct that, to rethink about space and time. And in that sense, the only solution is interruption, because we can't predict, and this is also why the narrative of technology saving us is so dangerous, because we rely on the idea that the system collapsed and now it's going to be a brighter future. And the only possibility for things to change is if we stop doing the same thing, to do something else, to do something different. So the idea of interruption for me is key to change anything we do, including the making of the world.
Yes, so before we finish, because we do have a couple of minutes, I wanted to come back to that, because we've talked about a lot of things today. We talked about nationhood, we talked about trauma porn in art, we talked about sentimentality, and this is to bring it back to the original question. So with those romantic narratives of nationhood that are being enacted today by our governments and also our artists, and thinking about the roles of empathy in the production of that art, and thinking about artist residency as mediators between all of these ideas. Paco talks about interruption. Is there something, Susanna or John, that we can talk about to begin to start a dialogue to offer solutions? Because to say this is a solution, it's impossible, it's utopic. But what can we say to start thinking about those dialogues about how to change that, or at least mediate it for a bit?
Maybe. Oh,
Go ahead, Susanna, and then John. Mm-hmm.
okay.
Oh, that about changes. I don't know. I think that my whole life, my conscious life, it was like kind of struggle for human rights, feminist rights, and so I think that I am in the constant fighting for changes. So it's part of my life. It's not like now in this period, in this isolation, we need to think about it, about the changes. It's like endless endless process, like personally, concern of my life. I want to say that's why the changes is always inside and outside of me, like this fighting, this really struggle for some changes. Like Armenia is very patriarchal country. Armenia now really would love to mobilize all people under this very sometimes very radical nationalist ideas. So many problems. Recently, that the revolution happened in Armenia. So this Armenian pavilion, where I was appointed curator, I dedicated to the revolution, but I made kind of very feminist inversion, because the male artists, well, just visualizing revolution with some video materials, but women artists, scholars were analyzing revolution. So that usually, in this binary opposition, that rationally, like this ability of analyzing critics is male. realm, and women are more emotional and etc. So I would love like this just simple gesture of inversion to make this kind of changes. And many attendees they said that it's really very good idea. It's really interesting, and they were really impressed. And the catalog of the pavilion, all textile materials are by women, or analysis about revolution, everything, that all our text. So it was really very important for me to show the work that our intellectual women, that even in Armenia, because sometimes even feminists from Europe, there was kind of discussion, and they were always speaking about Simone de Beauvoir, Simone de Beauvoir. But I said, that Simone de Beauvoir is not very much topical for us nowadays in Armenia. We are more interested in post-colonial feminists like Gayatri Spivak, or even these black feminists like Audre Lorde, and etc. And they said, really, you did read Simone de Beauvoir? So like typically Eurocentric question that I can't read, like Gayatri Spivak said that can subalterns speak. So the question was, really, you did it? You read the book of Simone de Beauvoir? I said yes, and even in English. So it was really, it's sometimes really, yeah, fun to say that there is this kind of. So the changes is like, I think it's uh, endless struggle. This could be only in this way, only we can have some changes.
John?
Yeah, that was beautifully said, Susanna. Um, I think for us, yeah, it's easy to kind of orientalize China and Hong Kong, and for many people to, if they were to have any um, preconceived ideas of what to do here, they might be interested in many aspects of a rich Chinese history, whether it's language, culture, or just there's a rich history of Chinese culture that people may think they want to explore while they're here. And I think for us, the interruption is mainly just um, thinking intentionally about the model of the residency, and how we really just encourage people to not have any preconceived ideas of what they might do while they're here, and to have empathy in being here and being with the people, and just to be open-minded. And I think our conversation with them does help steer them into um, kind of these more meaningful ideas, and to get away from that sentimentalization or orientalization of Hong Kong and China. And so I think just in a context that is hyper commercial, just to keep pursuing this platform where we can encourage artists to make work that is uh, not with an end goal, not necessarily for uh, the final product, is very needed in Hong Kong. And so for me, I'm encouraged when artists come and say, like, amongst the busyness of the city, they can we offer a space to just slow down and reflect, and to have a breather, and to come up and think with new ideas. That's just something that's really lacking, and that's our way of, in a very small way, in this grand scheme of things, how I see us moving forward and kind of causing that interruption. And so, uh, yeah, I think even during this whole recent period, um, our artists in residence have given us encouragement. Just seeing how they have dealt with, while they're here, they've just been very understanding and very inquisitive of what is going on. Like, why are people protesting in the streets? And when the pandemic happened, just their kind of um, calmness and understanding just kind of encouraged us. And so we just hope to yeah, keep running the residency in this kind of, and offer something that does not really exist much in Hong Kong. So
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, John. I want to know if anybody has any final remarks before we go. Any last minute words before we finish this amazing panel. It's been an amazing, amazing conversation.
Yes, I would like.
It was a really great pleasure to communicate with you. My final remarks: just let keep in touch, never lose each other, because I think we can collaborate, because so many points of really many common interests, and yeah, so this is my really really big hope that we will continue. Let's do it.
Thank you,
And
Susanna.
thank you, organizers, for this really amazing session. Thank you. And thank
Thank
you,
you,
John.
Susanna. Francisco, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I think I not. I think I know that I'm in the same sense that Susanna was explaining her experience with how feminists from specific regions in Europe would ask her, "Have you read this book?" And, you know, they get amazed and mesmerized by that. I think I know more than I think that I'm very grateful for the experience of writing the essay and then being confronted by the editor in that sense, because it is what triggered this whole symposium. And this is something that resonates with our journey, and Kirsten Buick have said for many occasions, you have to learn how to identify your allies, and this is precisely what we all have been saying through the panels, specifically Susanna and John, but through the entire panels of the symposium. It has been this voice of how we have found each other resonates. And in that sense, it's very similar to the experience that many residencies have. This is not something new to us in terms of coronavirus and how the crisis had hit everyone really hard. It's something that it's not putting us into action. We were already working actively to rethink place and history, to think about space and time. And in that sense, for me, what I would say I hope for is the next battle, which would be class. Because just as you were mentioning, sentimentality and specifically empathy as a social emotion situates us through class so that we ignore the red flags of genocide, that sexiness of porn traumas, as you were mentioning. It is, I think, is the next battle that we have to fight, because class makes us complicit in many ways, and it makes us have more it gives us a common ground to ignore the reality of the call to action. So if I could hope for the next battle after this whole thing is gone, is precisely to rethink class, and to challenge all these new waves of sentimentality that are situating us in relation to the nation, because it really feels like the 19th century in many ways. These times are, again, and not only because of the pandemic of the early 20th century, but many of the ideas that we're seeing are reinvented, are reused. It's exhausting in many ways, that visual culture is so heavy that it's very hard to challenge it. But yet, I think we will continue, and I think the next battle should be class.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for
I'm
that.
reading now the book of Audre Lorde, Where We Stand, about class matter, feminism. Yeah, so I am in the right way. Go to the class matter. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Yeah.
John, any last words?
John, microphone is.
No, just yeah. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really glad to be part of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you again to our host, Arquetopia, Francisco, Nayeli, Tonali. Thank you for all your work, and we'll see each other next time, hopefully soon.